Some fortunes don't begin with $1. They begin with something everyone else walked away from. The pen felt heavier than it should have in Ethan Walker's hand, its tip hovering just above the line where his name would turn everything around, or end it all for good. And through the wide glass window of the office, beyond the polished floors and quiet voices, a horse stood alone in the fading light, still as a memory that refused to fade, her silhouette cut against a Texas sunset that burned low and copper across the horizon. And no one inside that room could have guessed that the man, about to sign a deal worth more than $1 million, had once stood in a place that smelled of dust and rusted metal, with nothing but 50 cents in his pocket and a choice no one understood, because months earlier the world had been a much smaller, harsher place, one measured in unpaid bills and dry land cracked open like old scars, where the wind carried more silence than hope, and the name Ethan Walker didn't mean much of anything anymore. Not after the cattle were gone and the banks. Letters came folded sharp as knives. Not after the neighbors stopped asking how he was doing because they already knew the answer. And on that afternoon when the sky hung pale and tired over a forgotten auction yard, Ethan had stood at the back of a crowd that didn't notice him. Men leaning against wooden rails, boots scuffing dirt that had seen too many stories in the same way. And when they dragged her out, the little foal barely lifted her head, her legs thin as fence posts, her coat dull, beneath a layer of dust that no one cared enough to brush away. She looked smaller than the word horse deserved, like something unfinished, something the world had already decided didn't need to go on, and laughter came easy to the crowd, the kind that didn't need cruelty to feel right, just habit, just the quiet agreement that some things weren't worth saving. The auctioneer called out numbers that fell flat into the air, $10, $5. Even one, but silence answered every time, stretching long and thin until it snapped into murmurs and shrugged shoulders. And that was when Ethan felt it. Not a thought, not even a reason, just a pull somewhere deeper than logic, the kind that doesn't explain itself. And before he knew it, his voice cut through the noise, low and steady like it didn't belong to a man with nothing left. 50 cents, he said. And for a moment the world tilted just enough for people to turn and look at him. Really look, as if they were seeing something misplaced in the wrong story. And then the laughter came again, louder this time, sharper, but Ethan didn't flinch, didn't lower his eyes, because the foal had lifted her head just enough to meet his gaze. And in that quiet space between them, something passed that no one else could hear, something that didn't need words. And when the gavel fell with a hollow knock that echoed longer than it should have, Ethan stepped forward with a single coin in his hand, not knowing that in the months ahead, that small, trembling creature would lead him down a path no man in that yard would have believed, a path that would turn dust into something else entirely, something closer to a miracle than money ever was. The coin made a small sound when Ethan placed it into the auctioneer's hand, a thin metallic ring that seemed too light to carry any kind of future, and yet it lingered in the air longer than the laughter that followed, as if even the wind had paused to take notice before moving on. And when the rope was passed to him, rough and worn from hands that had long stopped caring, he did not pull, he did not force. He simply stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle between himself and the small foal, because something in her stance told him she had known too much pushing already. And for a second nothing happened, the crowd shifting, a man coughing, boots scraping dirt, until she took one uncertain step forward on her own, then another, her hooves pressing softly into the dry ground like she was testing whether the world would hold her this time. And Ethan turned without a word, walking toward the open gate as if it had already been decided, the murmurs rising behind him, voices, low and amused, someone calling out that he had just wasted his last 50 cents, someone else saying the animal would not last a week. But he did not look back, because looking back had never changed anything for him before, and outside the yard the light was already beginning to soften, the late afternoon stretching shadows long across the dirt road that led nowhere special, just a narrow path between worn fences and fields that had forgotten rain. His old pickup truck waiting with one door that did not close quite right, and a bed scratched by years of hauling more than it should have. And he paused, there, glancing at the foal, noticing the way her sides moved with each shallow breath, the faint tremble in her legs that she tried to hide by standing still, as if stillness could make her invisible. And he reached out slowly, not to grab, not to claim, but just to rest his hand against her neck, feeling warmth beneath the dust, a quiet pulse that had not given up yet, and for the first time that day, something in his chest loosened just a fraction, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long, and he led her toward the truck, guiding her up the narrow ramp with patience that surprised even him. Each step a careful negotiation between fear and trust, until she stood inside the trailer, small against the metal walls, ears flicking at the hollow echoes of the space. And when he closed the gate, the sound carried out across the empty road, sharp and final, as if marking the end of something neither of them would return to. The engine turned over with a tired cough, and as the truck pulled away, the auction yard faded behind them, its noise swallowed by distance and dust, leaving only the steady rhythm of tires on gravel and the faint shifting of hooves in the trailer behind him. And as the miles stretched out beneath a sky that had begun to turn the color of old copper, Ethan found himself listening, not to the engine, not to the wind, but to the quiet presence traveling with him. A life that no one had wanted, now tied to his own in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable, and he did not know yet where it would lead, only that for the first time in a long while, the road ahead did not feel entirely empty. By the time Ethan turned off the main road and onto the narrow stretch of dirt that led to his ranch, the last light of day had already slipped behind the low hills, leaving the land washed in a quiet gray that felt older than the fences leaning along its edges, and the truck slowed as the tires pressed into familiar ruts, each bump echoing through the worn frame like a memory that refused to settle. And ahead, the house came into view, small and weathered, its porch sagging slightly as if it, too, had grown tired of holding on, one dim light glowing through a window that had been patched more than once. And when the engine finally went silent, the sudden stillness wrapped around everything, broken only by the soft shift of movement from the trailer behind him. And Ethan sat there for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel, not quite ready to step out, because bringing something new into a place that had known only loss carried a weight he could not easily name. And when he opened the door and his boots touched the ground, the dry earth answered with a faint crunch, a sound that traveled farther than it should have in the quiet. And he moved toward the trailer slowly, reaching for the latch with a steady hand, pausing just long enough to draw a breath that carried dust and the faint scent of old hay drifting from the barn nearby. And when the gate swung open, the foal stood there, still and watchful, her small frame outlined in the fading light, her ears flicking at the new silence, as if measuring whether this place would ask more of her than the last one had. And Ethan did not rush her. He simply stepped back and waited, giving her the space to decide. And after a moment that stretched longer than it should have, she stepped forward, one careful movement at a time, until her hooves met the ground, and she stood there beside him, not running, not pulling away, just breathing, her sides rising and falling in a rhythm that began to steady as the night settled in. And together they walked toward the barn, its doors hanging slightly uneven, the wood worn smooth by years of use that had long since slowed, and inside, the air carried the quiet warmth of a place that still remembered what it was meant to be, dust floating in thin beams of lantern light as Ethan set it down on a hook and moved to clear a space, pushing aside old tools and a bale of hay that had been saved for no particular reason other than habit. And the foal followed without needing to be led, her steps hesitant but willing, until she reached the stall and lowered her head slightly, as if accepting the shelter without question. And Ethan draped an old blanket across the rail, the fabric thin but clean, and spread fresh hay across the floor, the simple motions grounding him in a way nothing else had for a long time. And when he finally stepped back, he watched her for a moment, noticing the way her eyes moved across the space, not with fear, but with a quiet awareness that seemed older than her small frame. And then she did something that made him pause. She turned her head not toward the stall, not toward him, but toward the far wall, where a rusted piece of metal hung loose against the wood, shifting slightly with the night breeze. And she stood there, still as stone, watching it as if it mattered, as if something in that faint sound called to her in a way Ethan could not yet understand. And he frowned slightly, following her gaze, but saw nothing more than an old barn settling into the dark, and yet he could not shake the feeling that the moment held something just out of reach, something waiting. And when he finally turned down the lantern and stepped outside, the sky above stretched wide and silent, the stars beginning to show one by one. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan found himself standing still, listening, not to the emptiness he had grown used to, but to something else, something quiet and unfamiliar, like the beginning of a story he had not meant to start but could no longer walk away from. Morning came slowly to the ranch, not with sound but with light, a thin wash of pale gold slipping over the horizon and stretching across the dry fields until it reached the barn, touching the wood in quiet lines that revealed every crack and nail that had held on through too many seasons. And inside, the air still carried the cool of the night, mixed with the soft scent of hay and dust that settled into everything over time. And Ethan stepped through the door with a cup of black coffee in his hand, the steam rising faintly in the early chill, his boots moving with the steady rhythm of habit as he checked the stalls, not expecting much to change from the day before. But when he reached the far end, he stopped without meaning to, because the foal was not lying down where he had left her. She was standing, alert in a way that did not match her fragile body, her ears pointed forward, her gaze fixed once again on that same section of the wall where the loose piece of metal shifted slightly with the breeze, tapping now and then against the wood with a soft, irregular sound that should have meant nothing. And yet she watched it as if it held a memory or a direction, something beyond the simple shape of the barn. And Ethan took a slow step closer, setting the cup down on a nearby ledge, the faint clink of ceramic against wood causing her ears to flick back for a moment before returning forward again. And he followed her line of sight, studying the wall more carefully this time, noticing the way the boards had warped just slightly, the grain of the wood uneven where years of weather had worn it thin, and the metal itself was nothing more than an old hinge, half rusted and barely holding on, something he had meant to fix months ago, but never found the reason to. And now, standing there in the quiet, he felt something shift in the way he looked at it, not because it had changed, but because she had, because the way she stood there, still and focused, made the ordinary feel like it was waiting to be understood. And he moved closer, reaching out to still the hinge with his hand, stopping its movement, so the faint tapping sound faded into silence, and the foal reacted instantly, her head lifting slightly, her body tensing just enough to show that the absence of the sound mattered, as if the quiet itself had taken something away. And Ethan let go slowly, allowing the metal to sway again, the soft tap returning, and once more she settled, her breathing easing into that same steady rhythm. And he frowned slightly, not in confusion but in curiosity, the kind that does not demand answers right away, only observation. And he stepped back, watching her for a few moments longer before turning to gather a small bucket of water, setting it down near her. And she drank carefully, each movement measured, but even as she lowered her head, her attention never fully left that wall, like a compass needle that refused to turn elsewhere. And outside, the day grew brighter, the sun lifting higher and casting longer shadows across the yard. And Ethan moved through his morning tasks with a quiet focus, checking fences, walking the perimeter of land that had seen better years, his eyes tracing the lines of dry earth and worn posts that leaned just slightly under the weight of time. And yet something about the morning felt different, not in a way he could explain, but in the way his thoughts returned again and again to that small stall in the barn, to the foal who had chosen to stand and watch something no one else would have noticed. And when he returned, wiping his hands on his jeans as he stepped back inside, she was in the same place, the same posture, as if time had passed around her but not through her. And he leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms loosely as he studied the scene, the faint sound of the metal tapping, the way the light shifted across the boards, the stillness of her frame. Against it all, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The space between man and animal filled not with questions, but with a quiet understanding that something here, something small and easily overlooked, was beginning to matter in a way neither of them had planned. And Ethan did not know yet what it meant, only that for the first time in a long while, he was paying attention to something beyond survival, something that asked him to look closer, to listen longer, and to trust that even the smallest detail might carry the beginning of something he could not yet see. By midday, the sun stood high and unforgiving, pouring heat across the land until the air itself seemed to shimmer above the dry fields. And inside the barn, the light filtered through narrow gaps in the wood, falling in long, pale strips that shifted slowly as the hours passed. And Ethan found himself returning there more often than his work required, drawn back not by duty, but by something quieter, something that had taken root the moment he noticed the way the foal refused to look away from that single place along the wall. And now, standing just inside the doorway, he watched again as she remained fixed in that same position, her body still, her ears angled forward, her attention held by the faint, irregular tap of the loose hinge moving with the breeze. And it would have been easy to dismiss it, to tighten the screw, silence the sound, and move on with the long list of things that needed fixing. But something in the way she responded made him hesitate, because each time the metal shifted, her breathing changed just enough to notice, not fear, not tension, but recognition, as if the sound itself carried meaning. And Ethan stepped closer, slower this time, careful not to interrupt whatever invisible thread had formed between the foal and that small piece of forgotten hardware. And he crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level, his eyes tracing the line from her gaze to the wall, studying it with more patience than he had given anything in years. And that was when he saw it. Not something obvious, not something that would catch the eye at a glance, but a subtle difference in the boards, a faint line, running along the grain where the wood did not quite match, as if two pieces had been joined at some point long ago, and then left to age together until the seam nearly disappeared. And he reached out, pressing his hand gently against that section, feeling the surface beneath his palm, the texture worn smooth in some places, rough in others. And when he pushed just slightly, the board gave a fraction of an inch before settling back, and the hinge above it tapped again, a soft, hollow sound that seemed to echo deeper than it should have. And the foal shifted her weight, stepping closer to him now, her head lowering toward that same spot, her breath warm against his sleeve. And for a moment the barn seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the outside world had pulled back just enough to let this moment stand on its own. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind turning not with answers, but with possibilities, the kind that had not visited him in a long time. And he stood, brushing dust from his hands, stepping back to look at the wall as a whole, the uneven boards, the old nails, the faint marks left by years of use. And he realized that this barn, like everything else on the ranch, held more history than he had ever taken the time to understand. And now, because of a small, unwanted foal, he was beginning to see it differently, not as something worn out and finished, but as something that might still have something left to reveal. And he reached for a nearby tool, a simple pry bar leaning against the corner, its metal worn but solid, and paused just before using it, glancing once more at the foal, who stood beside him now, no longer watching from a distance but present, steady, as if she had led him here and was waiting for him to decide what came next. And outside the wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the dry scent of distant fields, and inside the barn the hinge tapped once more, soft and patient, like a quiet reminder that some things do not demand attention. They simply wait for it. And Ethan tightened his grip on the tool, not with urgency, not with certainty, but with a calm resolve that had been missing from him for longer than he cared to admit. And for the first time since that day at the auction, he felt something close to direction, not because he understood what he was about to uncover, but because he had finally chosen to follow something beyond what could be seen at first glance. The metal edge of the pry bar slid into the narrow seam with a quiet resistance, the kind that came from years of being left untouched, and Ethan did not force it. He leaned his weight slowly, feeling the wood respond inch by inch, as if it were deciding whether to give up what it had been holding for so long. And the hinge above tapped once more in the shifting air, a soft, hollow rhythm that now seemed less like noise and more like a signal. And the board finally gave with a muted creak, pulling away just enough to reveal a darker space behind it. Not deep, not wide, but hidden all the same, a pocket of shadow where dust had settled undisturbed. And Ethan paused, lowering the pry bar, his hand hovering at the edge of the opening as if crossing into it required more than just movement. And beside him the foal stood close, her presence steady, her breath warm against his arm, not urging, not afraid, simply there, as if this moment belonged to both of them. And he reached in carefully, his fingers brushing against something solid beneath the layer of dust, something that did not belong to the rough texture of the barn, and he pulled it free slowly, revealing a small metal box, worn at the corners, its surface dulled by time but still intact. And for a moment, he just held it, turning it slightly in the light that filtered through the gaps in the wall, noticing the faint engraving along the lid, letters nearly faded but still there if you looked close enough, and he ran his thumb across them, clearing away the dust until the marks became clearer, not a name he recognized, but something that carried weight, something that had been placed here with intention, and he opened the lid with a careful motion, the hinge giving a soft click that echoed faintly in the quiet barn, and inside, folded neatly despite the years, lay a set of papers, their edges yellowed but preserved, and beneath them, something else, a small tag attached to a thin chain, and Ethan lifted it, holding it closer to the light, reading the numbers stamped into the metal, numbers that did not make sense at first, until his mind began to connect them to something distant, something he had not thought about in years, records, registrations, bloodlines, the kind of details that only mattered to people who dealt in horses beyond simple work. And he felt a slow shift in his chest, not excitement, not yet, but recognition, the kind that builds quietly before it becomes something else. And he set the papers aside carefully, unfolding one of them just enough to see the heading, a name printed clearly across the top. A ranch he had heard of once, far from here, known for breeding horses that carried more than just strength, horses that were trained, tracked, valued in ways this land had long forgotten. And he exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling in around him, because the small foal standing beside him, the one no one had wanted, the one he had bought for almost nothing, might not be what she seemed, and the thought did not rush him. It did not overwhelm him. It simply stood there, steady and quiet, like the animal herself, waiting to be understood, and he closed the box gently, holding it in both hands for a moment before looking down at the foal, who had lowered her head slightly, her eyes calm, almost knowing, and Ethan felt something shift again, deeper this time, not just curiosity, but purpose, the kind that had been missing from his life for longer than he could remember. And outside the wind moved across the fields, carrying dust and the faint promise of change, and inside the barn, the loose hinge tapped once more, softer now, as if its work had been done, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt empty, but full of something just beginning to take shape. The barn held a different kind of silence after that, not the empty kind Ethan had grown used to, but one that carried weight, as if the air itself had begun to listen, and he sat on an overturned bucket near the stall, the small metal box resting in his hands, turning it slowly as the late afternoon light filtered in through the slats, laying thin lines across the floor and over the foal's back, and she stood nearby, no longer fixed on the wall, her attention now drifting toward him, as if whatever had called her there had already done its part. And Ethan unfolded the papers again, this time more carefully, smoothing them against his knee, his eyes moving across the faded print, taking in each detail with a patience he had not felt in years, and the name at the top stayed the same. But below it were lines that began to tell a story he had never expected to find inside his own barn, records of lineage, dates, markings, numbers that traced back through generations, and though he was no expert, he knew enough to understand what it meant when a bloodline was documented this way, when names repeated in certain patterns, when symbols marked something more than ownership. And he glanced toward the foal, her small frame outlined in the warm light, her coat still dull with dust, but carrying a faint undertone he had not noticed before, something that hinted at what might emerge with time, and he reached out, brushing his hand along her neck, feeling the quiet strength beneath the surface, the steadiness in her stance that had never quite matched her fragile appearance. And she did not move away, did not startle, she simply stood there, her breathing slow and even, her eyes calm, as if she had always known this moment would come. And Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as the pieces began to settle in his mind, not all at once, not in some sudden realization, but gradually, like the way the land changed color when the sun began to set. And he thought about the auction, the laughter, the way no one had seen anything worth noticing, and he wondered how many times something like this had been overlooked simply because it did not fit the shape people expected, and the thought stayed with him as he folded the papers again, placing them carefully back into the box along with the small metal tag, closing the lid with a soft click that seemed louder than before, and he set it aside for the moment, not out of doubt, but because there was something else he needed to see, something that could not be written down, and he stepped out of the barn into the open light, the sun now lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, and he opened the gate to the small corral, guiding the foal out with a gentle motion, not pulling, not forcing, just walking ahead and letting her follow, and she did, her steps still cautious but more certain than they had been that morning, and once inside the enclosure, he stepped back, giving her space, watching as she stood still for a moment, taking in the open ground, the wide sky above, the stretch of land that had once meant everything to him, and then nothing at all, and then, without warning, she moved, not with speed, not with power, but with a kind of fluid grace that seemed to belong to something larger than her small frame, her legs finding a rhythm that was too smooth, too balanced for something so young and so neglected, and Ethan felt it then, not as a thought, but as a certainty that settled deep in his chest, that what he had brought home that day was not just another broken piece of the world, but something that had been hidden in plain sight, something that had waited, quietly, patiently, for someone to see it. And as the foal slowed again, returning to stillness as if nothing had happened, Ethan stood there in the fading light, his hands resting loosely at his sides, no longer thinking about the bank or the debt, or the long list of things he could not fix, because for the first time in a long while, he was not looking at what he had lost, but at what might still be possible. The days that followed did not announce themselves as important. They arrived the same way all days did on that stretch of land, with dry wind moving low across the fields and sunlight creeping slowly over fences that had leaned too long in one direction. And yet something had changed in the rhythm of Ethan's mornings, not in what he did, but in how he moved through it, because now there was a quiet sense of direction guiding his steps, something that began each day in the barn where the foal waited, no longer fragile in the same way she had been when he first brought her home, her coat beginning to catch the light differently, her stance more grounded, her movements more certain, and he found himself watching closely, not with expectation, but with attention, noticing the small changes that built over time, the way her stride lengthened just slightly, the way her balance seemed to settle into something natural, something that did not need to be taught, and he worked with her in simple ways, leading her through the corral, letting her follow the curve of the fence line, giving her space to move at her own pace, and each time she did, there was that same quiet grace, that same fluid rhythm that did not match her past, and it began to draw attention, not from crowds, not yet, but from those who passed by on the distant road, slowing their trucks just enough to look twice, to wonder, to notice that something on Ethan Walker's land did not quite fit the story they had already decided about him. And one afternoon, as the sun leaned west and the air carried the faint promise of cooler hours ahead, a pickup pulled up near the gate, its engine idling low as a man stepped out, his boots clean, his eyes sharp in a way that spoke of someone who knew what to look for, and Ethan watched him approach without hurry, his hand resting lightly against the wooden rail, not defensive, not welcoming, just present, and the man nodded once, his gaze already moving past Ethan toward the corral where the foal stood, ears forward, her body still but ready, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching long enough to carry meaning of its own, before the man finally broke it, his voice calm, measured, asking where Ethan had found her, and Ethan did not answer right away, because the question held more than it seemed, and instead he simply said the truth in the simplest way he knew, that she had been unwanted, that she had been overlooked, and the man's eyes lingered on the foal a moment longer, something shifting there, something that looked like recognition, or perhaps respect, and he stepped closer to the fence, leaning slightly as he watched her move when Ethan gave a small signal, a quiet gesture of the hand that sent her into motion, not fast, not forced, but smooth and controlled, her hooves finding the ground with a rhythm that carried both strength and ease, and the man exhaled slowly, almost under his breath, as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect, and when he turned back to Ethan, There was no laughter in his expression, no doubt, only a quiet seriousness that had not been there before, and he asked if Ethan had ever considered what she might become. And Ethan held his gaze for a moment, the memory of the metal box, the papers, the numbers still fresh in his mind, and he answered not with certainty, but with something steadier, that he was beginning to understand, and the wind moved through the field then, carrying dust and the faint sound of the loose hinge tapping inside the barn, a distant echo of where it had all begun, and for the first time, it no longer sounded like a question, but like an answer that had been waiting all along. The offer did not come that day, or the next, and Ethan did not expect it to, because whatever had begun on his land was not something that rushed. It moved the way the foal did, steady and deliberate, revealing itself only when it was ready, and in the weeks that followed, the man returned more than once, never with pressure, never with promises, only with the same quiet attention, watching from the fence line as the foal grew stronger, her frame filling out, her coat beginning to shine. Beneath the Texas sun, her movements gaining a confidence that no longer needed to prove itself, and word began to travel the way it always did in places like that, slowly at first, carried in passing conversations at feed stores and roadside diners, until one morning a second truck appeared, then a third, each bringing someone who had heard just enough to be curious. And Ethan did not change the way he worked. He did not put on a show. He simply let them see what was already there, the calm bond between him and the animal. The way she responded not to force but to quiet signals. The way she moved with a balance that spoke louder than any claim he could make. And each time they left, they carried something with them. A sense that they had witnessed something rare, something that did not belong to chance alone. And eventually the conversation shifted, not from curiosity, but toward value, numbers spoken more carefully, measured in terms that Ethan had not allowed himself to think about in years. And when the offer finally came, it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was written on paper and placed in his hands with the same calm respect that had defined everything leading up to it, a figure that stretched far beyond what that land had given him in a long time, enough to clear the debts that had followed him like shadows, enough to rebuild what had nearly been lost, and he stood there with the paper in his hand, the wind moving lightly across the field, the foal standing just beyond the fence, watching him the same way she had on the day he brought her home, steady, present, as if she understood that this moment mattered in ways that went beyond money. And Ethan did not rush his answer. He walked out into the corral instead, closing the distance between them until he could rest his hand against her neck, feeling the quiet strength that had grown there, the same steady pulse that had been there from the beginning. And for a moment he simply stood with her, the past and the present meeting in that small space, the memory of a coin pressed into his palm, the sound of laughter fading into distance, the soft tap of a loose hinge in a quiet barn, all of it leading here. And when he turned back, his decision was already made, not because of the number on the page, but because he understood what she had given him, not just a way out, but a way forward. And the deal that followed did not take her away from him entirely. It opened doors instead, partnerships that allowed her to become what she was meant to be while keeping the bond that had started it all. And in time the land changed, not all at once, but enough to show that something had shifted, fences repaired, the barn standing a little straighter, the house holding more light in its windows, and people who once passed by without slowing now stopped, not out of doubt, but out of respect, and on quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned that same deep copper it had on the day everything began. Ethan would stand by the fence and watch her move across the field, no longer the small, overlooked foal no one wanted, but something else entirely, something that carried both where she had been and what she had become, and he would think about how easily it could have gone another way, how close he had come to walking past that moment without seeing it, and how sometimes the smallest choices, the ones that make the least sense to everyone else, are the ones that change everything. And as the wind moved softly through the land, carrying the quiet sounds of a place coming back to life, one truth settled in without needing to be spoken, that sometimes the things the world overlooks are not empty. They are simply waiting for the right person to see what they were meant to be.